Hi, so this session is part one of 10 sessions looking at church in today's world. How can we reimagine church? What does mission look like? What areas do we need to change? What areas do we need to be thinking about? So we're beginning with living in a post-Christian society. This is very much thinking about Western contexts. And in our situation, we're looking at New Zealand, but many of these issues relate to just about every Western country in the world. So we live in an extraordinarily connected world now, in a way that history has never seen before, through the internet and through technology, and the ability to be able to share ideas, to connect with people across the globe, has had extraordinary impact on society and on worldview, even just in the last 20 years. It's not just about fashion or music or film tastes, which have all blended into something very similar, but also in the way that ideas are shared and thinking around worldview. There's a common set of a pattern that is emerging that is interesting and a phenomenon and disturbing all at the same time. So I want to kind of break them down into three areas, and we're talking pretty much about post-modernity or post-modern people. And sociologically, that's people that are born post-1970, which for a while has always felt like that's young people, but that's older than me, and I wouldn't call myself young. So people that are in their mid-50s and less are really within the postmodern realm of category, which is having huge knock-on effects for the church. And if we were to look at our demographic as a denomination, as the Anglican Church, it would be fair to say that the average age would be somewhere around the mid-60s, and that might be quite generous in itself. And so traditional churches in particular are aging at quite a fast rate, both in leadership and congregation. And this is worrying for succession, it's worrying for the future. How do we pass faith on to new generations? So there are three pillars that I want to just touch on, and this is taking from some different thinking out there, particularly influenced by a guy called Tim Keller, the City to City network. The first is secularism. So secularism has grown in power really from the age of modernity and accelerated from the 60s onwards. And secularism doesn't necessarily mean the absence of God or the absence of spirituality. But what it does mean is that people have, in large, begun to reject the meta parables, the big pictures, the big stories around existence, around life, and have connected the church to that as well. So we've seen a huge rejection of the church in terms of organised religion in just a few generations. And there'll be lots of different reasons for that, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But people haven't rejected God and they haven't rejected spirituality, but what's happened is that it's privatized. It's become very internal. And so, and internalized. So people don't see how faith and spirituality have anything to say in the public arena anymore. It's not something that should influence politics or education or the way that societies operate. In fact, some would say that Christian thinking or religious thinking have damaged the public arena over history. So it's not that spirituality has been rejected, but it's become very private. And it's something that I work out on myself in my internal life, and it's got nothing to do with anyone else. And it has no bearing on my outer life and my outer experience, external engagement in society. And I think it's fair to say that I'm hearing more and more people searching for spirituality, authentic spirituality. although postmodernity has rejected a lot of that kind of stuff along with modernity, the yearning for authentic spirituality is possibly greater than it's been for a long time. So there's a paradox with that, but we'll come back to that. Next would be relativism. So relativism is about saying that there is no overarching transcendent truth that defines us, that gives us, that unifies us. There's no big picture. There is no singular truth. Truth is now whatever you want it to be. It is relative. We can pick and mix philosophies, religious ideas, notions of right and wrong even are down to the individual to decide. There's no plumb line that is beyond the individual. I saw a film a number of years ago that said there is no right or wrong, only fun and boring. And I think that kind of summarised a huge attitude towards ideas of justice and jury. All those things are now regarded as social constructs. So that's good for you, but it's not good for me, would be the mantra of our generation. And that has huge implications, as you can imagine, on the church. That through the Bible says, no, there actually is a universal sort of set of absolute truths that we live our lives by that have unified humanity over a millennia. Big challenge. And the last thing would be tolerance. Tolerance is a really interesting idea. We're told to be open-minded, and all ideas and beliefs are to be tolerated and honoured. But the irony with that is, until you meet someone that disagrees with you, until you come across someone that says, no, I think that's wrong, or I think, I disagree. And then at that point, tolerance goes out the window because that person then is to be targeted and cancelled. We hear about cancel culture all the time. And so it's quite a disturbing reality that we find ourselves in now, that in the old days, you could have meaningful debate with someone that you disagreed with. Two people could sit down who maybe have vastly different perspectives on a topic or an issue, and could have meaningful debate. And so there would be an honour of the person. So you could disagree with someone as long as you were respectful and you honoured the individual in the process. And that opened up all kinds of interesting dialogue and learning, actually. But now that it's flipped, it's like ideas are to be guarded at all costs, even at the expense of the person. So ideas are protected, people are attacked. Whereas, just a generation ago, the reverse was true. The thing with that is that it's the power of the masses. And we see the momentum of this growing through social networks and online discussion forums and stuff. And you can see anyone that stands up and puts their head above the parapet and says, no, I think there's another way, particularly if it's a contentious issue, is cancelled and attacked ruthlessly. And usually by people that would have kind of quite strangely mixed views and incoherent, sort of irrational arguments themselves. Consequently, what's happening is we don't really know what anyone thinks about anything, because if you have an opinion, you certainly wouldn't share it in the public arena for fear of being shut down. So we're being told through the power of the masses what we should believe about all kinds of things, and some things may be interesting and helpful around issues of tolerance, whether it's sexuality or gender issues or political issues or social issues around repression or inclusion, racial issues. And they're meaningful arguments, meaningful things to stand up for. But because people are being told what they should believe, it's almost forcing the opposite, that they say they agree, but you don't actually know if they agree. And it's creating polarization. So our societies, although we're trying to become tolerant, are becoming more polarized. And it's strange to say that we should be tolerant until we find someone that we think is not tolerant, and then we shouldn't tolerate them. Again, irony. If we just looked at these three pillars, and we could pick other topics as well, but I'm trying to keep this succinct and a space for you to kind of think about a few areas and have discussion over. It's obviously pushed Christianity to the margins. We want to know why our churches are shrinking, why people aren't interested in faith or what we might call religion, or coming and sitting in our meetings on a Sunday morning. But these three pillars have pushed us into that space of, we're wrong in every way, aren't we? So we're saying that there is a broader view of the cosmos, a universal approach to spirituality, and that God is the creator of all life. Well, actually, the tolerance thing, I think, is important. The church should have been setting the tone for tolerance all along, as Jesus did, in loving your neighbour and welcoming the stranger and loving the sinner. But we probably became quite bigoted ourselves and made that very difficult for ourselves, and are known to be people that aren't that welcoming and that judge people. So we've created a difficult bed for ourselves. To follow Jesus in today's world is so countercultural that it's a very difficult thing to do. And young people aren't necessarily prepared to make that stand, to profess that they will follow Jesus. It's costly to follow Jesus today. Cultural freedom has not brought us the kind of freedom that we hoped for in the West. It has disconnected us from a universal truth that unites humanity through the ages. It has disconnected us from a core identity of knowing who we are, why we are made, who made us, and what the future might look like. It's disconnected us from hope. I think humans are searching for a transcendent reality that overarches everything, that they can connect to and be part of something bigger than themselves. It has probably cost us our very souls as well. And so as Christians and as the church, our challenge is to relearn how to tell the story again. What is this unifying story, and who created the universe and why, and how can we know the one who created all life? How do we describe him? How do we find language? What narratives can we use? How do we create meaningful community? And the big thing today that goes hand in hand for me with this inner search for authentic spirituality is the loneliness that has come about by our so-called connectedness. People are looking for authentic community. They want to belong to something. And the church has something to say about that. At our very essence and core, as imperfect as we are about community. And we should be about radical inclusion, of loving the outsider and allowing them to be part of the family with all of the stuff that they bring, and to be loved unconditionally in that place. To practice that kind of community, which involves eating together and doing life and supporting one another in hardship, being generous to one another, providing for, looking after the sick, and widows and orphans, as Jesus talked about. The church is a radical group, a movement. I don't want to say institution or even organization, but it's a family. It's a movement of people that has the power to bring real life in the world. But we have to reimagine ourselves and find new language to communicate. The old ways have served us well up until this point, maybe up until about 20, 30 years ago, but they're not serving us well anymore. We need to reimagine, rediscover, rethink, reframe our buildings, our language, our programs, our definitions of community, the way that we approach worship, the way we teach and communicate, the way that we form leadership structures, how we define who's in and who's out. All of these things need rethinking. There is a little bit of hope, particularly for Anglicans, that in all of that, we might say that Your average younger person isn't going to want to come into a traditional service and sit through a structure where there is a talk and some songs and then they go home again and don't see anyone for another 7 days. There is this interest in ancient forms of spirituality and ancient rhythms of spirituality. And I think our liturgies and our approach to liturgy is a beautiful thing. Young people are looking for liturgies or liturgical practice that is life-giving, that is led in an informal way, but is deeply unifying within a community and connecting us to something transcendent, bigger than ourselves. The New Zealand prayer book, I think, is utterly brilliant as a foreigner coming into the nation. I think it's been really well written and produced. It's something that will serve us into the future, but it just depends how we use it and who's leading it and how it's framed in what context. I came across a group not that long ago that were wanting to be a sort of a church of some sort, but they didn't want to use that language. They didn't want to be in a building. They didn't want to be connected to a traditional wineskin structure, but they wanted to use liturgy in the way that they gathered together around the meal table. And that says it all. So there's a few things for you to think about in discussion in your leadership teams around some of these 3 pillars of relativism, tolerism, and secularism. Thinking about, well, what does that mean today? How do we engage people that might be against that or have a problem with that? Or might need a new experience of that? How do we create authentic community? What does that even mean? What does a community look like beyond the Sunday service or a mass? What does that look like? How do we do that? What does the role of food and gathering and fellowship look like in church? And how do we reframe this language? How do we describe what God's like in today's world? How do we rethink mission? How do we rethink the way that we tell the narrative and live out that narrative as modeling? And then how do we use liturgy? How do we bring the sacramental life into the public arena in a way that is understood, in a way that people go, oh, wow, that makes sense, and that they can fall in love with it afresh. It will need new language and it will need a new way of packaging. But I think God has given us those things as a means of connecting us to Him. But society has moved on and we need to rethink and reimagine what we're doing. So over to you. Hopefully that's helpful in terms of some discussion things and some themes to be chewing over, praying over, and asking God for wisdom. Also look to other churches outside of your denomination. There are other groups trying to grapple with the same issues, and we can learn from one another. There are some really interesting best practice or some ideas that have been experimented with out there in Anglican churches and outside. And yeah, it's good to look around. It's good to learn and to critique and to see what else God's doing in His kingdom right now. Thanks for listening.